I'm just waiting for this to come online. It's probably online, but I need to be able to see folk. Okay, I think that's everything. I believe I'm on. Hello, good morning. If you're here, say hi. Let me see you. Um, for for this week's live stream, I wanted to go into, um, again, this is not as much focused on history and historical threads. It's not exactly a mimetic thread, but I think it's an important part of the context. It's an important aspect that's useful to track, and I think it's clarifying. You'll find this reference to ego showing up a lot in, and it's in part of culture. It's saying that guy's got a big ego. Like, well, what exactly does that mean? We have some intuitions, but this shows up a lot in spiritual spaces as well. And I wanted to offer some clarity that I think a good understanding of memetics can give about why is talking about ego relevant? And what exactly are folk talking about? Why does the ego arise? Whatever that is. Okay, and what would be a healthy relationship with ego? Do you want to kill the ego? What exactly does that mean? What's left when you kill the ego? And so I don't claim to know all of these answers. I'm not trying to do a sweeping overview of literally all of people's references to ego. I think the use of the word is a little inconsistent because folk have not, they're clustering together a bunch of intuitions, which themselves have a mimetic context. If it seems fitting, I might talk about some of that. That actually ties into some of the mimetic threads going through time. It's a lot of the times when people are talking about ego, what they actually are talking about is sort of the momentum of sin. Particularly in spiritual contexts where people are talking about how bad the ego is and you need to get rid of it, or you need to conquer your ego or tame it or kill it or whatever. Saying, oh yeah, that's coming from ego, that bit there. They're not tracking the meaningfulness that they're getting from having this thing inside that they need to fight. And a lot of that comes from predominantly a Christian context. So I may go into that if it seems fitting. But because of that, there's not a lot of coherence around what people are talking about when they refer to ego. I want to offer a little bit of that. Because what I'm offering is more coherent, it's not going to cover all of the cases, and it may touch on some things that I think a lot of people might disagree with in terms of their intuitive understanding of how ego works. But that's what happens when you get a clearer definition. When you see, oh, this is specifically the mechanism that is relevant. Here's why it's relevant, at least in this context. It falls very directly out of memetics, about what it means to be a human being who is capable of being a vessel for means. So if you are a human being, there's a how question, but the how that starts to get into some mess. So if you're completely new to this series, just a little bit of context, because some of what I'm saying there are memetics and blah blah blah. Like, what's this? I mean, if you've gotten this far and if you're still listening, and but you don't know what's going on, that probably means that you have some context. So somebody told you, hey, you should watch this video. So I want to mention a little bit the point of the sort of idea, sort of thrust that I have behind offering this series is that in just these little snippets, as it occurs to me of, oh, this is a piece that needs to be said, or this is a piece I want to talk about, I'm offering a lens on memetics and the sort of the context that we're alive in today and why memes are important. When I say meme, I'm talking about sort of these patterns of thought and behavior that replicate across people. Right? So like jokes are memes, for instance. Every joke is a meme, and which jokes survive over decades and spread across people. It actually follows the pattern of a self-replicator. It actually has the structure that you can use biological reasoning in order to track how these work. In fact, the reasoning behind evolution absolutely applies to memes. The difference is that they are made of patterns of speech and behavior instead of being made of the behavior and patterns of molecules and atoms. So if you don't have to know what a meme is in a lot of detail in order to follow what I'm going to be talking about today. But the reason I find these important to talk about is that the structures that shape culture and human choice. Oh, hey, Olga. Cool. Oh, I'm glad that you're excited to watch this later. So the types of things that shape human culture, that determine whether we go to war, what kinds of technologies we build, what insights our civilization is capable of having, whether we're able to orient to climate change, the questions of civil rights and social justice. These are all, they're not just mediated by memes, it's actually defined by them. Even the fact that we're able to care about them and that we're even able to know about them and talk about them is mediated by memetics. So having a really rich understanding of memetics is an absolute necessity. It is a requirement for the human race to be able to function as a global species, as a global civilization. We don't have that right now. What we have is a bunch of fragmented pieces that link up into a system that's very fragile. And that fragile is adversarial in nature, which is part of why so much got disrupted by the pandemic and why we couldn't as a species orient to the pandemic in a sane way. So I don't know whether the human race wants to move in that direction collectively, in the direction of sanity and kindness in a collective way, without losing the value of the individual. I'm not talking about just generic collectivism. I'm talking about a lucidity of actually caring about everything that humans care about and really caring for those and encouraging them to be nourished. So I don't know whether the human race really wants that, because we seem to get a whole lot of excitement out of the kinds of drama that we're dealing with. But for the people who want it, and in case the world wants it, I want to encourage this kind of lucidity. And I'm not the only one. This is just my framing, my spin. So this series is offering those bits and snippets, and I mean for these to be observable separately from one another. You can watch all of them on YouTube, youtube.com/Morphenius. Okay, so for ego. So when I was a little kid, I used to play on the NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System, all the time. I was totally a TV junkie and video game junkie to the most that I could do, to the extent my parents would let me, so to speak. It was like I was a TV maximizer, and so in playing games like Super Mario Brothers, I have this little figure that sort of jumps around that is me. Like, this is fairly universal for video games. I'm just grabbing a concrete example. And so on the screen, I would have Mario, and I could say, and if mom asked me, oh, so what's that? Oh, that's Mario. That's the figure I control. Right? I hit the A button and it makes the guy jump, and I hold down B, and then I move and he runs instead of walking. And it's funny that my hands remember this in this level of detail. Little things of once I get a fire flower, I also hit B in order to shoot the fireballs. It's amazing the details that stay if you practice long enough. So I could answer these questions without any difficulty. There's no confusion. But as I play the game, there's a sense of if I'm navigating a whole bunch of the bad guys and then I jump over one of the little pipes and one of the little chomper monsters comes out just as I'm jumping, it's like, oh man, it got me. Right? I don't say, oh man, it got Mario. Right? I can, but it's not as natural. It's easier for me because I'm sort of embedded in the game. I'm playing the game. In principle, you could play the game without Mario being a visible figure there, but it would be very confusing. You wouldn't know where your actions are positioned. So the reason that there's a visual depiction of Mario on the game is so that you have a reference point, so that you can see how your interaction on the game controller interfaces with the game, because you control that figure. And then that figure, as it moves, you have a better sense of how your use of the controller will let you interact with the environment of the video game. So the purpose of the Mario icon is, or the little Mario figure, the bunch of pixels that is Mario, is it's not for you to examine, to look in a lot of detail and see, oh, I can finally see my own eyes clearly. You don't look at that in order to shave or to like to make sure that your face is clean. Like it's not that kind of reflection. I see Tin mentioning it's also hilarious to look at body language when someone is playing, e.g., them tilting to one side in a racing game when taking turns. Yeah, there's an experience that like we had a flying simulation game, and you tilt as you fly. And my mom's cousin at one point while playing one of these games managed to smack his head against the wall next to where the computer was because of that. Yeah, so this highlights something really interesting about this merger. And so there are two aspects that I want to highlight. One is this this merger aspect, which I'm switching channels to since Tin mentioned this, and I just spoke to it. This sense of, oh, it got me, the chomper got me. I'm inclined to use first person pronouns to talk about the little icon, right? To talk about Mario. Oh, I want to get that fire flower. I want to grab that coin. Oh, look, I just managed to duck through these bad guys. It's very natural to speak this way because we're sort of projecting our sense of self into that little icon, which is the purpose of the icon. Right? It's a very natural extension of how we interface with anything at all. I'll give some examples of that in a moment, but this is not a confusion. This is actually part of human intelligence. It's a beautiful tool. It's a beautiful capacity. But because of the nature of how, like the way that identity works, the way that our sense of self works, when you do that, your body will respond. I'll get to this because secretly your body is just like the Mario character. Okay, we'll get to that. So what happens is that as you're identifying as this figure, ah, man, it got me. Why did your body jump? Oh, it's because you're simulating the experience of being that figure, and you sort of simulate being hit. Oh man. And so the body actually responds. That's part of how you're interfacing. So this one point is this merger aspect. The other element, which is closely tied, is this aspect of, the technical term for this is your avatar. This is a funny loop that's happened in language. The term avatar started out, I actually don't know which language, maybe it's Sanskrit, but when the word avatar originally referred to the incarnations of Hindu gods. So I forget which way it goes. I think, what was it? Krishna, the original Krishna, was an avatar of Shiva. I think I've got that right. My understanding of the exact mythology details of India are quite fuzzy, of Hindu specifically, Hinduism, to the extent that Hinduism is a specific thing. So the idea is that you have these gods who are beyond the physical realm. They're related to Brahman, which is like the unity of consciousness. But when they incarnate, then the incarnation is a vessel for the god. It is the incarnated form of the god. So that's what an avatar is. And we borrowed that term to refer to these little icons. So technically, the little Mario figure in the game is an avatar. It is my avatar specifically. We don't use that term for those icons. It's just a reference point. Like, oh, that's Mario. And then you control Mario. That's usually how it's talked about for those games. This is much more common when you have MMORPGs like a World of Warcraft. I don't know what the in ones are today. For a while back, it was EverQuest. But because the thing is that usually you have a perspective that is a third person, sort of floating behind your character, your figure, and the character is your avatar. Okay, this also shows up in first-person shooter games where you're with other people, because so in a first-person shooter game, it's really, this is an interesting contrast point. For something like a Doom or Halo, you actually don't have an avatar when you're playing on your own. Right? There's your controls directly affect where the camera is, and where the camera is and where it's pointed directly interface with the environment. There's no extra representation of you in the game. Where you end up needing to express having an avatar in first-person shooter games, or first-person games in general. As far as I know, they're all shooters of some form. But the reason you would need to reference an avatar is if you have other people in the game with you. Like if you're doing a LAN game, so a bunch of your friends are networking together, and you're shooting each other, or you're working together to take on some sort of challenge. They need a way to see where you are. So if you don't have an avatar, they can't see you. There's just this fire that's coming out of nowhere. So in order for them to be able to reference you, they need you to have an avatar. And they need you to have some kind of representation so they can reference you, so they can see where you are. So your representation in the game becomes your avatar, even though you can't see it. Right? So this creates some really interesting effects with things like, and I understand you may be wondering, why am I talking about video games if I was going to talk about ego? I promise I'm getting there, promise. But this is a really helpful example set. I'm almost inclined to say that it's like an analogy, but it's not just an analogy. This is literally how it works. The exception being that the way that it literally works, the way ego works inside of a human being, is not run on computers, but it is run on something that might as well be a computer. It's the mimetic operating system. So I'm not going to go all the way into that, but I'll gesture towards it. But it's much stronger than an analogy. This is a description of the actual mechanism. It's just, this is an instance of the mechanism in terms of playing video games. But this is just easier for people to think about for the most part. So the, shoot, where was I? Oh, right. So a couple of days ago, I was watching one of the YouTube stars, Markiplier, who's playing with a bunch of his friends on, I think the game is called Raft. They're cooperating to try to build this raft that's floating on the ocean, and try to build resources that are floating around, and take supplies from islands in order to build up their raft. And there's this shark that keeps attacking them. So there's this struggle of, can we survive, and can we build up a really comfy raft floating in the middle of the ocean without starving or dying of thirst or whatever. Just notice I'm a little thirsty. So when now at one point, Mark puts on a helmet that is basically a shark head. They managed to kill one of the sharks, and they turned the head into a big hat so that you put on the hat. And this sounds much more gruesome than it is in the game. The game is cute. This is just, if you think about the details of this is quite gruesome. But when you put on the hat that is the shark's head, you're looking out its mouth. So the way that the game shows you in first-person perspective, like the way it showed Mark that he was wearing the hat, was that he could see the teeth. This is visually showing up right. You could see the teeth like this, sort of in his visual field, right? So that's fun. But there's a question of, well, what does it look like to others? And later on, they were using this to say who's captain. And later on, he took off the hat and handed it to somebody else. And when they put on the hat, you could see, yeah, the person is walking around wearing a shark head. So there's something very interesting about this, which is that those 2 points of experience give Mark a really important perspective, which is, when I'm seeing the teeth in my visual field, others are seeing me the way I see that person wearing the hat. So when I see these teeth, I can imagine how others see me. But when he's doing that, he's actually imagining his avatar in the game, which he can't see. Okay? This is a really critical, slippery point. And this is the place where, when we apply this in the real world, people get really confused really fast. It's not that there really is an avatar and he's imagining what his avatar really looks like from the outside. Okay? It's not that he's inside the avatar and he is imagining correctly what others are seeing he in fact looks like from the outside. That's a useful tool for imagining the scenario, the same kind of way that it is a useful tool for me to say, oh, I am trying to avoid these bad guys in the Mario game, rather than I'm trying to control Mario to navigate the bad guys. And I put myself in the character. So it's a useful shortcut to imagine, oh, these other people see me wearing the hat, because that is in fact what I look like from the outside. I'm just seeing it from the inside. But in fact, what's going on is the game constructs, in that case, he had three people, himself and his two friends. It was constructing three first-person perspectives, and each perspective was completely different. Each perspective the game would add avatars to that perspective so that it could see where the other two are located in space relative to the person in question. There is no perspective from which there are three avatars. Right? Now, that may actually be implemented on the game depending on how the game is designed. And in practice, a lot of programmers will imagine from a third-person point of view, which importantly, and this can be quite deep quite fast, so you want to be a little careful here. But for the sake of intellectual, like just a gesture towards something, there is no third-person perspective. This is part of the illusion. This thinking that there is a third-person perspective, a perspective from nowhere, is a convenient cognitive tool for being able to correspond different perspectives. But like this is just true in the game. You can see this in the game. There might be in the software an implementation where there are three avatars, and what it displays to a player instead of the avatar is this first person shift. But typically, I don't know about typically, but this can get slippery because people will add the confusion into the game design sometimes. So this can get a little complicated. Well, let me set the detail. I was going to focus on the side. And so this structure of first-person perspective, avatars, projecting images into your environment, and these are like mental images. How do you reach into the world? This is how ego works. So I haven't defined ego yet, but the really short version is the ego is your avatar for navigating the experiential world. Okay. Now, this can very quickly become confusing because if you ask, well, like, who's navigating the spiritual or the sensory world? What do you mean me? Who am I then? What is this referring to? This gets into a very particular sort of confusion. But the reason for that is roughly equivalent to if Mario in the NES game, if Mario could think about who he is and how he's navigating the environment he's in, but he didn't know about the player. He's just like his focus is on the environment because that's what he's for. He's an interface for the game environment, so he can, in some sense, experience the game environment, but he can't experience the player. And so, if you ask Mario who are you really? Mario say, it's a me, Mario. Right? It's like this isn't complicated. I'm Mario. I know who I am. I navigate these things. I save the princess. Okay, great, great. But Mario is an avatar. Okay? And that's absolutely critical to Mario's capacity to exist. Like Mario gets turned off when the player is not playing the game. Mario doesn't exist when the player isn't playing the game. Okay? So, but Mario wouldn't be able to know that, at least not by default. You might be, like, sometimes you end up with some interesting exceptions. Sometimes programmers will guide video game characters to talk to the player, sort of breaking the fourth wall. Those are quirky. Those are quirky. Those are interesting. Those are sometimes it's a very particular, almost aesthetic choice. This creates something that if you look up on TV tropes, something called genre savviness. This is in that category. This is like when in a horror film, when everybody's saying, look, we've got to split up to find our missing friend. They've got to be around here somewhere, and we'll cover ground faster if we just split up. And the one person is they're saying, guys, we're in a creepy house, and we have one of our people mysteriously disappearing, and now we're planning on splitting up and exploring places that we're not familiar with. Have any of you ever seen a horror film? This is a bad idea. And invariably, the person who's genre savvy gets ignored, and they're proven right, but that didn't matter. Right? So genre savviness, I think, is a really interesting thing to track here. So if I had to encapsulate a lot of this, if you get what ego is, I haven't described this, I've described an example of the mechanism. I'm about to move into what this is like inside of a person. But if you get it, if you see the thing, then arguably most of, at least the foundation of spirituality, goal, if you want to claim that there's a goal, I hesitate to I don't know what portion you want to say. Spirituality is a vast, vast area. So like the point of mathematics is, well, I don't know, it's going to be hard to say. But one of, a lot of spiritual accomplishment amounts to making your ego genre savvy so that it stops doing things that don't make sense. Okay, that's a lot of it. That's a pretty huge chunk of it. It turns out that in the process of doing that, the ego starts to be able to orient to true reality, but it can't fully orient to that. Sort of like, how would Mario orient to the 3D physical world? That's really hard. So I'm going to point at a couple of examples. So moving out of, so I've been highlighting examples of the mechanism, but now I want to point more directly at what's going on with ego. So examples of where you can see this closer to home. Okay, home being right in there. So I'm going to borrow an example from Peter Singer from The Untethered Soul. I may be butchering his example, but I find this one really helpful. So sometimes when I'm walking around and I'll go through a part of the forest and I'll make a turn and I'll see the beautiful golden light of the sun sort of dancing through the trees as the leaves sort of rustle in a gentle wind, and it's utterly gorgeous. And I'll think to myself, sometimes I'll say it out loud, but even if I don't, I'll think to myself, wow, that's really beautiful. This is coming to mind in part because I'm looking outside and seeing the beautiful sunlight of the day. It's a beautiful summer day right now. So here's an interesting question. What's the thought for? In order to think, wow, that's so beautiful, I have to already know it's beautiful. I'm looking at it. I'm looking at the light. I am experiencing the beauty. My heart moves. My body like responds. There's a sense of breath and sort of struckness and an enjoyment, awe. I'm present to this experience. It is beautiful. I have to see at least some glimpse of that in order to be able to recognize that it's beautiful. And then the commentary comes. Wow, that's beautiful. So if I already know, what's the commentary for? Furthermore, whom is the commentary for? Right? If I already know, why am I telling myself? So this is a very, very common phenomenon. It's incredibly common. Now, I'm not saying that there is no purpose. There's a very important purpose, a very important function. But a really key thing to notice about this particular process is that most of the time, like, so the way I'll often experience it is I'll be looking at this and I'll say, wow, that's beautiful. And if I'm not careful, like maybe my mouth says it on autopilot, wow, that's beautiful. Look at that light. Like, whom am I telling to look? If I'm alone, I still do this, right? So it's like, look at that light. God, the way it's dancing with the trees. Wow, that's really cool, right? So if I'm not careful, what'll happen is I'll start focusing on the commentary, on the fact that it's cool. Now I'm beholding it, I'm beholding the beauty. But if I focus on that's beautiful, I'm now moving from the direct encounter with the beauty to the observation that it is beautiful as articulated by whatever that inner commentary is. And now I'm actually experiencing the beauty less. Right? I'm focusing on the details of, yeah, the way the light moves this way, and that creates this kind of color. Oh, look at that, blah, blah, blah. And I start to go into this blah, blah, blah in my head. Now, this is particular to me. This is my design. Some people have different design setups. I'm giving an example of an egoic mechanism. Okay. Now, what is this for? So when I'm just going to say something flat out. I'm not really pointing. I'm trying to. My ideal here would be to show you and you to recognize this for yourself. But I'm going to say something that, frankly, most ego designs have a difficult time being able to process. And because most people are fused with their avatar, they end up thinking that they can't understand. Okay, so, like this is something that you can rearrange your avatar. You can rearrange your mind to be able to see clearly, and this expands your capacities. It doesn't distort your vision at all. It does quite the opposite. But bear in mind, what I'm about to say may sound like a weird claim. You may be inclined to make assumptions about I'm talking about some kind of ghost or something. I'm referring to souls. In a way, I am, but probably not the way that most people are inclined to think of them. So just bear in mind, you're likely to mishear this, but I'm trying to point at an experience to the extent that I can, gesturing towards if you look here, you'll start to see some things, and then what I'm saying will make more sense. So the I am witnessing the beauty. I don't need the commentary at all. Okay? The same way, I don't need Mario to be on the screen for me to see the screen. Okay? I can see the whole thing. In many ways, I see it better than Mario does. Better than I do as fused with Mario, because as Mario, I'm focused on how do I navigate this. But if I just look at the screen, I can see all of these details about the screen. I can see that the way that the like the coloration of the pipes and the I can notice things like, oh, like some of the little Goombas are like bad mushrooms, like either poisonous mushrooms or bad mushroom trips or something like that. And then you go and you get the good mushroom in order to be big and be able to take on things. Like, these are cute metaphors. What's up with the turtles? That's interesting. Um, these are thoughts that I can add, and the thoughts are still from the avatar. They're still the egoic system. But the point is that I can look at these things. I can notice a lot more than is relevant to me when I am sort of identifying as Mario, when I'm fused with Mario in order to navigate the game. So in that same way, I can directly perceive the world. I don't need the intermediary. But my avatar needs a way of interacting with the world, and it can't behold everything the way I can. So what's going on there? I'm just going to make a claim, and you can come to observe this for yourself. A lot of what's going on there is that there's a couple of motions that's happening. Part of the reason for the commentary is that the avatar, my egoic structure that allows me to interface with the world, the thing I use to be able to pick up the cup, to be able to talk to you, to notice how to turn, like I can turn the camera, right? My first person camera, right? I can move it around. I can choose to interact with the world. How does that interaction happen? Well, it's through an interface. And that interface has a lot of intelligence behind it. And it needs to know when I'm focusing on something, how does it interface with what I'm focusing? So it's basically trying to upload a simulation of what I am experiencing. A huge amount of the ego is based on linguistic mediation. Ego cannot exist to the richness that it does in humans without language. It's hugely linguistically constructed. This is part of why words can upset people so much or can inspire so much. So you're creating these simulated experiences with language. When I talk about walking through tall grass in the early morning, sort of the chill against my skin, breathing in the crisp air, my fingers glancing across the tall grass and getting moist from the dew. Do you notice how, in order to hear that and understand what I'm saying, it sort of has to create a simulated experience in your mind? It's not like it's not like I directly showed you those experiences. And if you compare the details of the experience, what color is the grass? How tall is the tall grass? How high does it reach on you? Are you embedded in the environment, first person perspective? Or are you watching it from the outside? How sunny is it? Is it overcast? There are lots of details here that when you compare them from one person to the next, you're going to find differences if you really zoom in on the details of what the simulated experience was. So this spontaneous generation, like you're not seeing, I mean, you're probably not seeing the same experience I was, right? So the language mediation, it's almost like breaking down an experience into code, and then you transmit the code, like computer code. And then you find a way to pull the code back into some kind of experience. And to the extent that you have systematic protocols for doing that, sort of like how the internet allows you to transmit images, you're not actually sending physical pictures through the internet. What you're doing is each monitor has a representation process that allows you to present a picture. When you look at a picture and you say, I want to send this picture, it converts the picture into some sort of digital format, sends the digital stream of ones and zeros somewhere else, and then that somewhere else has a process for taking that data stream and putting it onto a monitor. Now, there's a cool thing that we can do because we've worked out the protocols enough that you can actually take two monitors, put them next to each other, and transmit the image from one to the other and compare the two and see, like how similar are these? And we can get them really visually close such that a human eye cannot tell the difference looking back and forth between them. That's pretty impressive. Language does not have anywhere near the richness needed to be able to convey all of experience. It can't get even vaguely close. The reason the images work in computers is because you're almost uh, like Mario would be incapable of understanding every detail of the physical 3D world, but Mario would be capable of understanding pretty much every detail about his world, like the little flat, like 1.5D, because like kind of jump, like it's called 2D, little 2D side-scrolling world. He can't know it from the third dimensional point of view, but he can know, that's a pipe, and this is one of those moving platforms, and this is one of those pits that if I fall down, I die. But here's a different pit it's not really a pit, it's a gap that lets me down into the water level, and etc. So in that sense, if you imagine Mario and Luigi, a different figure in the game, were able to communicate, they would be able to talk about the things in their world with arguably perfect fidelity. The computer images are kind of like that. So this puts us in a really quirky position. The ego, the avatar, wants to allow us to interface with the world, and will download whatever, download is not the right word, it will simulate, it will generate a simulation of whatever it's looking at by default so that we can interact with it. Wow, that's beautiful. Right? So it can take maybe a visual snapshot, because you'll notice, like if you remember something like, what does the room look like behind you before you turn around? Can you remember? You might be able to get a mental image. And so those summoned mental images are coming from the ego structure. Right? You're interfacing with something. You ask it a question. What is behind me? It produces an answer. It's this. Same kind of experience as if you ask yourself, what was the last thing you ate? To answer that question, you have to wonder, which is to say, you're talking to a sort of inner servant. That's your ego. You're talking to an inner servant. That inner servant goes off and does something hidden and comes back and gives you an answer, sometimes immediately, sometimes with a delay. An example of the delay is if you're struggling to remember an author's name, and then a couple of minutes later, boom, Werner Vinge, or whatever. And you, it's like that. That's like the servant coming in and sort of yelling the answer, even after you've gone along. I might remember it later, but whatever. And then I'm going to go off and do this thing. Oh, it's Werner Vinge. So there's a very clear sense of interfacing with something. Who's interfacing with something? So these images, don't follow the thought train of who too much. I'm just gesturing towards the ego doesn't know who the player is, doesn't know who the user is. Okay. And in an important sense, can't actually know, the same way Mario can't know who I am. But that isn't to say that the avatar has to be completely clueless. And unfortunately, by default, most people's avatars are set up in a way such that they are, in a deep sense, very clueless, like Mario is. So I say unfortunately, it's just what is. Some of my own, a little bit of adjustment to do the kind of alignment that I want in order to play the game that I want to play. I want my avatar to be genre savvy. So that's a lot of what I'm working on. So, so what I think is happening with these commentary is that this avatar is sort of creating a simulated version of the experiences so that it can work with its version of the experience. Taking a mental snapshot, saying this is beautiful. Now we understand what beauty is. The avatar has no idea what beauty is. It has a bunch of ideas of what beauty is. So But I mean, I say it has no idea what beauty is, but I mean that in the sense of when you look at something beautiful and you are touched, you are touched. The ego can comment on how touched you are. It can generate sensations in the body based on its strategies for revving things inside to go, oh man, that was really, really impactful. And it meant all these things to me. And it relates to, like, it reminds me of when I was a kid and blah, 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 blah. Okay. That's valuable in the right context, but that's not you. That has nothing, I mean, it's not that it has nothing to do with you, but it has nothing to do with you, the same kind of way that Mario has nothing to do with me. It's just an interface. The interface matters. Without it, it can't interface. But it's not the actual thing that matters. It's not the foundational thing that matters. So I'm going to gesture towards a couple more things in this direction. I know this is fairly, this is a fair bit deeper than I usually dig when talking about these bits with memetic literacy. So if you're starting to feel into this, you may actually notice some kind of disorientation. I really encourage you, particularly if you feel some sense of alarm or a sense of, oh, this is everything. If you feel some sense of runaway process happening like that, overly excited, come back to the raw sensations of your body. Just focus on those. Don't worry too much about understanding this stuff. If you feel some sort of sense of, wow, this is so profound, if that starts to have you lose track of things like the feeling of your breath, your feet on the ground, if they're not touching the ground, the feeling of your clothes on your body, if you're losing track of things like that because of the excitement, that means that there is a fear that you have programmed your avatar, you've programmed your ego to address for you, and you got too close to being in contact with it. And now this system, like the difference between the kind of ego avatar that humans live in the 3D world and the kind of thing that Mario is that or one of the differences is that the ego is computationally very complex. It's basically a computer. It's in computer science, we would say it's Turing complete. So you can tell it to do basically anything. You can give it any kind of program and it can run a program. If you are scared of contacting the world directly and you want it to tell you what to do, this is like putting your character in a video game on autopilot. It can do things. It can decide what characters to attack. This doesn't happen in Super Mario Brothers, but this can happen in like MMORPGs like World of Warcraft. You can tell your character just automatically attack the nearest bad guy and this thing. And sometimes you have to chase it down and go, no, that isn't what I meant. But you could just tell it to go and then walk away from the game and just let the autopilot AI run your character. And in some sense, that can happen. In fact, most people live that way. You can end up living on autopilot. So what's happening if you're losing contact with your physical body, if you're losing awareness of your physical body, this is an awful lot like walking away from the screen. And the reason you would be inclined to do so is because you're in the habit of believing the ego story. I've got you. I'm going to protect you. Don't you do a thing. We need to do this. And the ego takes the lead. Okay, so if you're feeling a sense of overwhelming profundity about what's happening, the profundity is accurate, but the overwhelming part means that it's actually helpful for you to ground in your physical body. Okay, I have a few more things to say. Maybe consider coming back to the video later on instead of finishing if you're actually that wiped out, like actually taking a moment and getting to a place where you can really be here. That's the point, being able to really enjoy this game, so to speak. Okay. So, but for most people, I don't expect that to be a big issue. So an interesting question is, why does focusing on the body work? You might remember I sort of gave this this throwaway comment at the beginning. Your body is just like that, referring to the avatars in video games. In a way that I think most ego designs would find easy to approach for understanding this. We know, we don't know, but we pretend that we know that we receive information through our bodies, and that information through neural signals goes into our brains, and the brain creates this kind of processing that constructs our experience of the world, and this gives us the guidelines for how to interact with the world. And then the feedback loop between action and sensation is how we navigate things like, how do I pick up a cup? This is why even if your motor neurons are still functioning, if you numb the sensory, or not motor neurons, I mean you have a couple of different nerve pathways. Some go out to tell your muscles to tense in different ways, and some of them are for sensory input. So if you numb just the sensory input nerves, but not the motor nerves, you still can't move your arm. And the reason is that you need that feedback in order to be able to control your body. So the I lost track of it. I went too many steps. My mind lost track. Give me a moment. The body's avatar. Right. So we pretend that we know this, which means that the world you're experiencing is actually your brain's construction. You're not seeing the world, you're seeing your brain's representation of the world. So the question is, what's this? If this is your brain's representation of the world that you're experiencing through your body, then what is the body you're supposedly experiencing things through? It is literally an avatar. It is a representation of your interface so that your perception of your environment allows you to interact with it. The relevant part about being able to experience your body is that the experience of your body acts sort of like the Mario thing of, here's the cup, here's my hand, how do I bring them together? Okay. Right. You can get really trippy by asking, okay, well then where's the controller? But the controller is prior to sensation, it's prior to experience. So if you try to trace this, you'll end up getting quite confused, especially to the extent that you are used to using thought and sensation in order to navigate sensation and your own thoughts. The place to come from is silence, if you want to actually understand, if you want genre savviness to be part of the interface. So when I say your body is literally an avatar, it is literally an icon in a simulation, I'm not speaking metaphorically. It's actually how it works, even according to our current best scientific understanding. But it goes deeper than that. It goes way deeper than that. When you actually see how consciousness interfaces with sensation, I say see very loosely here, but the more closely you get in touch with this, the more obvious it becomes that your capacity to experience is based on having an interface. So what you're doing when you really come into, okay, this is the sensation of my physical body, you are reorienting on the points of interface. Right? So it's sort of like if you get really upset at a video game because, God damn, why can't I get around this bad guy? And like, all right, he just keeps swinging at me. Oh, what a jerk. I mean, all of that tension is like you're trying to control the bad guy. Almost like you're trying to use social shame or something to try to make him behave differently. But you don't have control over the bad guy. You have control over your avatar. So getting really clear about Well, the only way I affect the boss that I'm trying to beat up or whatever is through what I do with my avatar by reorienting on where is your actual center of control. You stop trying to reach your control through things that you don't have, like the interface doesn't match. It's like trying to lift this cup without using my body, which like legends say is quite possible, but I haven't seen how to do it. And if I did, guarantee it would be through some kind of interface that would in effect, like I think there's a reason why even in mystical contexts they'll talk about having multiple bodies, and that in some sense if you could psychically lift the cup, you'd be doing so with a different body, like feeling into the bliss body and noticing the way in which you are interconnected with all things, and therefore you can feel the way in which your desires can manifest directly. Well, guess what? That's the interface. So you can't really get away from this. You can ignore it, but your entire experience is saturated in this. So when in spiritual context, when they're talking about your ego and you need to kill your ego, and ego death feels like literal death on the inside. Well, yes, the reason is death, like literal physical death, is death of the ego. That's precisely what it is. Say 10 mentioning the boss versus video game avatar distinction is very nice. I struggle with identifying with my problems. Yeah. If you think of identification as where am I working on, or where is my interface of control? Where am I projecting the center of control? That's not a precise definition of identification, but I think it's pretty good. It's functionally really good. So in spiritual contexts, in talking about killing your ego, why? Why do you want to kill your ego? The reason is this autopilot thing can be very tenacious. If some of my viewers will be familiar with something that's called AI risk, or existential risk from artificial intelligence. There's an internal version of that, and the fact that the ego is Turing complete, which is to say anything a computer can do, the ego can do, which is actually why computers can do it. It's a projection of the capacity of the ego. You're figuring out how to get a computer to do the thing that your ego can already do. You're just sort of optimizing some aspects. You're making some aspects more efficient. But you end up with what amounts to an internal AI takeover, to the extent that you let your avatar's AI run the show. For complicated reasons, I don't really want to get into here. Like if you're super curious and you ask questions about it, I'm happy to answer some questions, and we might go in that direction. But in terms of looking at, we're about an hour in, and wrapping up and feeling, okay, this is the essence of what I wanted to say. I keep adding too many caveats and my mind is dropping pieces. Like, okay, let me preface a little bit less. I forgot what I was saying there. So anyway, so in terms of ego death, right. So sorting out the autopilot. If you're living your life on autopilot, it's like, why are you playing the game? And there's a tremendous lost opportunity. It's a beautiful opportunity. So there's something very beautiful, very true coming into, why am I even playing this game? Here I'm being much more metaphoric, like game as opposed to what, because this is literally all of sensory existence here in this 3D world, so to speak. Like, it's more complicated than that, but so if you're just doing everything on autopilot, you're sort of witnessing, it's a little bit more like watching a movie than it is playing a game, which is fine. If you want to watch a movie, that's okay. But there's a lot more that's possible here. It's like turning on your autopilot, your AI for your figure in World of Warcraft, and then treating the game like a movie. There's something missing, and there's a lot more that becomes possible. You have vast freedom. You can be much more clever. There's some things the AI will do that are much more efficient, clever, and fast than you can do manually. That's important. There's a reason for the AI, but the AI shouldn't run the whole show. Not if you're interested in the vastness of what's possible. So exactly the same thing is true for life. So the idea is not that you want to kill the ego, it's that you want it to be genre savvy enough that it stops grabbing the steering wheel every time you aren't looking when you don't want it to. You want the ego to serve your process of interfacing with the world. Most people did not consciously design their egos. They were reactive to little bits. And this starts to get into in the context of, well, what does this have to do with memetics? What I'm describing is the platform on which memes run on you. Memes are code. It's the code that this world runs on. Your ego is made of this code. The same way operating systems run programs on computers, and both the operating system and the programs are made of code. Okay. There's a key element here that I'm not going to go into all the details in this, just because it would be its own discussion. I've hinted at this before, like when I talked about why schools are awful in a previous episode of this. That there is one way of viewing this is that most memes, most of this code gets installed via installers. You have installation programs, and these installation programs are themselves memes. They're memetic structures. And the most interesting ones fall into one of two families, either parasitic memes that are mostly interested in their own survival and will use avatars. They will use ego structures in order to ensure their own survival. It's sort of like cordyceps, the zombie fungus that infects ants. And it has a whole life cycle. So there are parasitic memes like that. And then there are symbiotic memes, which also rely on human avatars, human egos, in order to survive. But the way that they do it is to show each avatar and each person running the avatar, I am a beneficial resource for you. Let me make that clear. And it does so by actually having value and offering value. So you sort of fuse with it, and in some sense you become it. You integrate it into your avatar. So your avatar becomes bigger and stronger by the act of the symbiotic fusion with these larger codes. An example of this is metta, loving kindness. So the issue is parasitic memes have an incentive to create a very particular sort of confused avatar state, and to keep them confused, and to encourage the avatars to stay in autopilot mode. This dominates the way in which our culture teaches children how to build egos. So basically everybody has a lot of parasitic code sitting in their avatar interface. You've got to weed that stuff out if you want to play the game at a genre savvy, really lucid level where you're really playing the game. And this is an ongoing process. This is like the metaphor kind of breaks down, because this is a little bit like Mario could find his own code to some extent and could start to reprogram himself, which you want to be really careful, because you don't want Mario to reprogram himself. You want the player to reprogram Mario. Right? So you want to be really careful about that. So you don't want the autopilot to decide how the autopilot gets dismantled. This is where a lot of people get very confused. You talk about all this stuff with ego resistance, and you got to punch through that resistance. It's like, well, it's really not that complicated. It's honestly not that complicated. If you look around at your lived experience and you track the difference between there's that perception, and then there's, yeah, I'm looking around the room and I'm seeing all these colors, and I'm really centering in my body. Yeah. Like this is what's meant by spiritual ego. If you go, oh, okay, right, I'm gonna become awakened, I'm gonna become enlightened, right? I've made some progress. I've had a Kensho, which is actually true with me. I've had a Kensho experience, but so the whole thing about, well, don't make too big of a deal of it. The reason is, if you make too big of a deal of it, it's actually integrating into the autopilot, which is trying to deal with feelings of inadequacy as the fuel for keeping you in autopilot. It has nothing to do with, oh, don't enjoy the fact that you had a Kensho too much. Enjoy it all you want to. Enjoy anything you want. It's all good. It's all beautiful. It's wonderful. The the question is, where is the choice that you're currently making coming from? If you have reasons for what you're doing, it's probably the autopilot. Why are you listening to the autopilot? Why are you letting the avatar decide what you do? Which is not to say that the avatar never should. I let this interface take over the process of, how do I walk across the room? I just say, I want to walk, and it gets up and it walks. Beautiful. I spent years trying to figure that out, right? As a baby. I figured, like, this is how I become a toddler. Okay, how do I do? All right, I figured that out. I worked out that part of the game. And sometimes I go back and I remaster that level. I sort of tune it a little bit. I found out I was hitting my ankles in a way that was harming them. So I have to shift how I walk a little bit. That's over a year ago I found this out. But for the most part, I can just go, I'm just going to walk. I'm going to go for a walk. I can do that. That's wonderful. That's part of what autopilot is for. But I walk so that I can experience all of this, so that I can play this game. Okay? So if you have some glimmer of that, some hint of, oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense. The point of this, like when I say something like this and I'm saying, does this make sense? The fact is that the player already knows all of this, but the player knows this, you know this, the same way you know when you are witnessing something beautiful. The explanation I just gave, this entire thing, this is me putting the bow on the end here. The entire thing that I just described is me offering something to the ego so that it has the opportunity to become a little more genre savvy. I'm using genre savvy very metaphorically here. Like, it's not like you're playing a particular genre of video game, although you kind of are. You kind of are. That's where you start to get into, well, how do you shift genres? How do you shift channels? That's magic. But by magic, I mean something like, well, what if you choose what kind of video game you're playing? That's like, no character has that kind of power. Yeah, but the player does. The player totally does. It's not going to defy the code of the game. It's working with the code of the game, but you can do things that are beyond the capacity of the character. Totally can. It's not, the character does not define what the player can do. It's just part of the context. So everything that I just shared with you here is like it makes sense to whom? If there are pieces that I've pointed out that when you look at it, you know I'm speaking truth, where does the knowing come from? What you know is presented by your interface, by your avatar, by your ego. But that you know, that's deeper. And that's you. Okay. So all of this description is allowing the ego to have a model of itself. It already had a model of itself, but it can notice this in more detail. This is helpful because that whole AI internal AI takeover thing, sorting out how to get that AI to do things that you want, that's part of the game. That is part of the game. I should mention, by the way, that in saying all of this, this is a fairly intellectual way of approaching all of this stuff. Approaching it intellectually has very strong limits because it's entirely within what the ego can do. You have to do things that are beyond the ego, sort of anchor in that place in order to really straighten this out. Because otherwise, the ego tries to edit itself, and you end up with programming loops. You end up with sort of a runaway AI effect that can be very gnarly. And you can end up repeating the same kind of problem over and over again. So you're like dating the same problem in different people over and over again. You can get stuck there. And even the thoughts about it can actually contribute to the loop. To get out of that, you have to stand outside of that structure. And you can't understand mentally how to do that ahead of time, because if you could, then that process would be included and it would get wrapped into the ego's autopilot, and then you would be stuck again. So the move that you have to make is actually beyond mental understanding. You can understand that part, the meta level. That is a deeper practice. So I guess I've not mentioned this, I don't think, in any of these videos, but I want to start representing and holding this energy a little bit more forward. What I've given here is not a proper energetic transmission at a deep level. It's like the same comparable frequency too, but it's not very deep in terms of the frequency of Mage, the program that I run. But I want to let you know that if you're looking at this stuff and you're going, oh man, this lights me up and I want to do this. This resonates with me and this is work that I want to do. If you want my guidance, my support, that's what Mage is. It's basically a, you can think of it like a dojo or like a yoga studio where we train these foundational skills so that we can be more deeply awake. And I hold the space in that kind of context, really embodying mimetic literacy, not as a concept, but as something lived. It starts to break down a bunch of these structures, a bunch of these parasitic structures, and to replace them with something else. Now, if you don't resonate with that, but you're still just interested in what I have to say, that's cool. I'm happy to put these out. There's no, I make a point of not hooking. Hooking is a very, like, well, this is your unique opportunity. There are lots of places that teach people this stuff. Right? This is not a scarcity thing. Hooking is a parasitic mimetic structure. Scarcity is part of the parasitic ego's code. You'll end up eliminating scarcity, your sense of, oh God, FOMO, oh no, like that eliminates the deeper you go in this kind of work. And so along those lines, I want to emphasize, like, this isn't like your only chance or anything like that. I'm letting you know that's part of what Mage does. So if you really like what I'm doing and you want to dive deeper with me, that's a pathway that's available. So just shoot me a PM. Like, hit me up on Messenger or if you're watching this on YouTube, I guess you could go to Facebook, but you can also just, God, what would be an easy way for people to contact me that way? I guess the only public way that I have right now is for people to contact me through Facebook. So yeah, I guess you need to go to Facebook, to facebook.com/Morphenius. But I will, I'll end the plug there and I'll see, yeah, do any of you who are live here, see, I know Tim at least has been here for a bit, at least was here as of 17 minutes ago. Yeah, do you have any questions or comments? Anything to add before I close? I'll give you a few moments to bring up something. I know there's a little bit of a delay too, so maybe you're just hearing this. Okay, looks like I'm not seeing anything. So unless something comes in the next couple of seconds, I guess I will bring this to a close. So thank you so much for watching. If you watch this on the replay, um, go ahead and reply. Let me know if you have any, whatever your response is, what are you taking from this? I would love to hear and feel that from you. And if you have any questions, go ahead and drop those in. I check the comments for this, both on Facebook and also on YouTube. I take a look at those. So thank you so much for watching. Fantastic rest of your day.